Hello and welcome back to Microbiology. Today we're going to get into the first of 3 PowerPoint presentations on disease. Infectious disease is going to be again the topic that we'll do, so this is just infections, and we're going to do this by systems. So in disease 1 here we're going to look at things that affect the skin and eyes, but also the nervous system. So let's start off with MRSA or MRSA, again something many people have heard of and know about. But I want to point out that this is a pretty common thing nowadays, that MRSA is actually out in nature and routinely causing infections. And at this point, MRSA is again resistant to multiple antibiotics. So multi-drug resistant Staph aureus is a common thing you hear nowadays. And the idea that this needs again a portal of entry, though, through things like breaks in the skin from things like injury or even shaving. But again, the causative agent, even in MRSA, is Staphylococcus aureus. The idea here is there's multiple strains or versions of Staphylococcus aureus, but they're all going to have some basic core features, like they're all gram-positive cocci that form clusters. Again, they're staphylo, meaning again cluster. They're non-motile, and they're actually again going to be pretty sturdy in terms of what they do in the environment. The idea is they're non-endospore forming, but they can survive in a variety of situations like high heat, high salt, and even extremes in pH. So you can see here how we have Staph aureus affecting blood, so we get that hemolysis or zones of clearing. Again, there's an inner and an outer zone of hemolysis with this particular strain. So here's the summary of the MRSA skin infections. Whenever we look at these, notice their layout with causative agent, mode of transmission, virulence factors, prevention, treatment, epidemiology. The idea is again that review sheet that I post up in Canvas asks for these particular topics. But as a general idea, look at the presentation to help you understand most likely what I'll test you over. Notice I didn't really spend any time talking about prevention or again epidemiology other than it's found in nature, right? The idea here is use what we spent time on in the presentation to help you narrow down the field of possible questions on the exam. The next infection we're going to talk about is impetigo. This is going to be an infection of the surface of the skin, causing the skin to flake off or peel off. But what's interesting about this one is it's caused by 2 different pathogens, Staphylococcus aureus and Streptococcus pyogenes, or even potentially a mixture of the 2. This is really going to be found primarily in children and will have again characteristic features of the infection like the peeling or shedding of the skin. These tend to be very localized though, which makes it very different from other infections we'll discuss in a bit. Staphylococcus aureus has several different virulence factors, and depending on the infection, each one may be more prevalently displayed. In the case of impetigo, the exotoxin, the exfoliative toxin A and B, are going to play a big role. This leads to that blistering and then the shedding of the skin, as we saw. Coagulase is going to be also pretty important. We see it coagulates plasma in blood and causes fibrin to be deposited around the bacteria, concentrating the exotoxin in an area of local damage. So we, again, in impetigo, see that localized infection. Strep pyogenes is also going to cause several other diseases like strep throat, scarlet fever, pneumonia, puerperal fever, necrotizing fasciitis, even blood infections that can cause sepsis. The idea here, though, is we're going to talk about several of these pathogens multiple times, but we're going to have to do so in terms of their location of causing infection. So often the first time we introduce a pathogen, we'll give you more information, and in the future we won't give you all that detail because we already did it. So since this is our first discussion with Streptococcus pyogenes, it's important to point out that it's a gram-positive cocci that's also beta hemolytic. It's going to also produce virulence factors like hyaluronidase or even adhesive elements increase the likelihood of causing serious infection, and as such we consider those virulence factors as well. So here's a comparison and a summary of, again, impetigo. You can look through here and compare the 2. So let's move on to cellulitis. Cellulitis is going to be caused by a fast-spreading infection in the dermis and subcutaneous. So now again, we're going deeper in the skin. Ultimately, this is characterized by pain and tenderness, swelling and warmth, and this can ultimately lead to things like fever and swelling of the lymph nodes. A quick reminder on the swelling of the lymph nodes. The swelling of the lymph nodes is typically illustrating that a pathogen has been recognized and the body is currently working to try to fight the infection. I want to point out that it's not uncommon to see red lines associated with this, usually running away from the area of infection. And naturally, this usually happens on the lower appendages like the legs. I do want to point out that immunocompromised individuals are at most risk for situations like this. So here's that sheet that sums up again cellulitis. So let's move on to another staphylococcal skin infection. This one's called staphylococcal scalded skin syndrome, or SSSS. This is going to be primarily seen in newborns and babies, and will usually be picked up during the birthing process. I want to point out that this is like impetigo, but now this is a systemic form, so it's not just localized patches. This peeling and shedding of skin is going to happen all across the body. Again, the primary cause of this would be the exfoliative toxins A and B. So you can see one of the things that happens is the development of bullous lesions, but then we get a quick shedding of the skin that allows for ultimately patches of skin peeling off. Here's that nice summary sheet of SSSS disease, or staphylococcal scalded skin syndrome. The next topic we're going to go over is gas gangrene. Gas gangrene is going to occur deeper and is also known as myonecrosis because the Clostridium that causes this is going to attack the deep tissues that's going to be muscle. The idea is, again, Clostridium and Bacillus are two endospore forming bacteria, but Bacillus likes oxygen while Clostridium likes an anaerobic condition, and that's why again this has to happen deep. In the muscle there's very little oxygen available, and as a result Clostridium can grow readily. So usually this occurs whenever we have a deep cut or wound that allows for Clostridium to be deposited away from oxygen. Once away from oxygen, it readily grows and releases really two or multiple endotoxins, I should say, that's going to break down muscle tissue, hence the name myonecrosis. There are again going to be multiple forms. There's anaerobic cellulitis, which is going to remain localized, and then there's true-on myonecrosis, which will spread rapidly even into very healthy tissues. Clostridium perfringens again is an endospore forming gram-negative bacteria that's going to again cause serious damage. This will produce something called alpha toxin, which straight up murders red blood cells, resulting in tissue damage. We also see collagenase. That collagenase is going to help break down collagen, allowing this to readily spread throughout the tissues, and even hyaluronidase is going to play a role in the breakdown of tissues. It's important to note that again Clostridium perfringens starts the infection of gas gangrene, but other bacteria have to join in as well. It's important to note that again the Clostridium has to work in an anaerobic condition, again deep in muscles, but the other bacteria can even work on the surface of your skin, so we get necrosis or death along the whole length of the limb. That's why again surgical removal is often the appropriate response here. The next topic we're going to focus on is what's known as vesicular or pustular rash diseases. There are going to be two primary diseases that we're associating with, again, these rashes that will cover the body. That's the pox viruses, things like chickenpox, smallpox. But there's also going to be hand, foot, and mouth, which we won't really talk too much about. So let's start off our discussion with chickenpox. Chickenpox is actually a pretty common disease that overall was relatively mild. This is often known as a childhood disease because typically the earlier you got it, as long as you weren't very young, the better the outcome would become. As you get older, there's potential risk for greater complications. And so literally in the past there used to be what was known as pox parties, where individuals that contracted chickenpox would again have neighborhood kids come visit them, which conveniently gave those kids chickenpox as well. The illustration was it was better to catch this again at a younger age because you were more likely to be able to effectively fight it off. And it offered then again potentially protection for a lifetime. But I want to point out that this is again a virus that is also tied to the formation of shingles. So again, this virus was something that would come into the body and then remain in the body. Nowadays, we do see a vaccine available for infants 12 to 15 months and then for children 4 to 6 years. So let's talk about that formation of shingles. With shingles, again, it's still the same virus, but it's the reactivation of the virus after it had become latent. Because whenever you have chickenpox, the virus will often be fought down, but then would reside typically along one nerve. And the idea is whenever you get shingles later in life, because immunity has gone down, the virus presents along the nerve in which it was hiding. So you typically get asymmetrical infection following the path of the nerve. So naturally, since again the immune system was what was holding this in check, whenever the immune system goes down due to things like x-rays, stress, immunosuppressive drugs, surgery, other infections, that's whenever shingles are most likely to show up. Smallpox is the next pox virus that we need to discuss. Smallpox actually is not really found in nature anymore because in the past it was super dangerous. And there were two forms, variola major and variola minor. Major was clearly the more dangerous one, hence the name major. It was very virulent, led to toxemia, shock, and potentially death, but also was known for causing intravascular coagulation. As a result, we were really focused on trying to eliminate this threat. And naturally, this was one of the first vaccines that was produced. And people readily took the vaccine because they knew the risk and dangers associated with getting smallpox. So ultimately, people were readily taking the vaccine, and thus there was no place for the virus to ultimately reproduce. And as such, it disappeared from nature. I do want to point out that this virus is not completely gone from the planet. Smallpox is still actually maintained in research facilities, but under high security and high scrutiny. The idea is, since the virus is not around anymore, the vaccine is not routinely given. But if the virus was to come back out, naturally we would have to start vaccinating individuals for it. Here's that comparison of, again, the different forms of the vesicular pustular rash diseases. Again, we didn't present on hand, foot, and mouth because, again, I didn't deem it that necessary for us to go over. So let's move on and talk about measles. Measles is going to be an important thing to eliminate because of its risk of death. Ultimately, people fail to remember that literally at least 430 children die of measles every single day. And the vaccine is what actually keeps that number even low. The illustration is that through vaccination, measles becomes a non-issue or a pretty rare occurrence. But the more we again fail to vaccinate, the higher numbers of deaths will be associated with this. Ultimately, I want to point out that literally the year before the vaccine was introduced, there were 6 million people that died per year from measles. So again, as long as we vaccinate, the number of deaths will remain low. Vaccines save lives, and as such are very much necessary. There can be bigger complications with getting measles. Again, cases of pneumonia, bacterial secondary infection, even laryngitis is well known for occurring. But we are more concerned with panencephalitis, which could potentially kill you. The next topic is rubella. Rubella is also known as the German measles. Rubella would ultimately cause a minor rash with a few complications. But if, again, this was contracted by a fetus in the womb, this would typically kill the fetus. And the idea here is this is something that can be controlled and avoided. So again, the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine save lives and should be taken. Congenital rubella, again, can happen, and if it happens early in pregnancy, the chances of miscarriage and death of the offspring is very high. But again, even if it does happen later, there will still be damage, including things like deafness, cardiac abnormalities, ocular lesions, and even mental and physical retardation. Here's that comparison table for, again, measles and rubella. So let's move on now to warts. Warts are also known as papillomas. They're basically going to develop in every person. It's rare to find a person that does not have some form of papillomas or warts. But there are different warts, and we often name them off of where they infect. So seed warts, again, will often be found on things like the fingers and other parts of the body, but are relatively painless and typically just elevated rough patches. Plantar warts, on the other hand, will typically be found on the feet and will be often deep and very painful. Flat warts, as the name suggests, are flat and found all over the body. Ultimately, it's important that you understand that warts are caused by the human papillomavirus. And as we've discussed before, again, HPV or human papillomaviruses have been tied to cancers. Leishmania is going to be a protozoan disease that's actually transmitted by female sandflies. It really comes in two forms, cutaneous leishmania and mucocutaneous. With cutaneous, again, it's just going to affect typically the skin. With mucocutaneous, it affects both mucous membranes and skin. So let's move on to cutaneous anthrax. Cutaneous anthrax, again, is anthrax infection of the skin. The idea here is the causative agent, Bacillus anthracis, will often enter through a cut, rip, or tear in the skin. The result then is the formation of a blackened, deadened region known as an eschar, where the endospore has entered the skin and allowed to reproduce. I do want to point out that if left untreated, this has a death rate of roughly 1 in 5. And this has been actually used as a bioterrorism threat back in 2001, but since then we haven't seen many cases of bioterrorism threats in the U.S. Here's that summary of the large pustular skin lesions, which includes leishmania and cutaneous anthrax. So let's move on now to a cutaneous mycoses known as ringworm. One of the first things I need to point out to you is ringworm is not a worm. It's actually going to be a fungal infection. It's caused by something called a dermatophyte. A dermatophyte is going to live on the exterior features of the skin, which again are non-living. Tinea is going to be again the species most commonly associated with causing these infections. There are multiple types of again Tinea species and thus multiple causes for ringworm. So here are some examples. So here's that summary of again the cutaneous or superficial mycoses. So let's move on to conjunctivitis. This is a common infection of the eye. The idea is, though, there are multiple causes for conjunctivitis. Bacterial infections will cause a milky discharge or colored discharge. The viral infections will have a clear coloration, and then the allergic response will also have a clear fluid, but it will be excessively large amounts. The idea is we're trying to wash out the allergen. We also see redness and eyelid swelling, as well as photophobia. Here's an image that illustrates, again, an example of neonatal conjunctivitis. I do want to remind you all of something. The people most likely to contract infections are really young, really old, and immunocompromised. So unfortunately, there will be several unpleasant images of very young people because they are far more likely to get infected. Here's the table that summarizes conjunctivitis. Since there are, again, multiple causes on this, again, just choosing the most common cause would be helpful, again, if we need you to study something like this for the test. So let's move on to another infection of the eye known as an ocular trachoma. An ocular trachoma is going to be basically an infection of the epithelial cells of the eye. The idea here is chlamydia trachomatis, which again is chlamydia, is going to infect the eye. I do want to point out that this is actually super common out there and is actually one of the world's leading causes of blindness. And this is just, again, chlamydia. So many cases of blindness could be prevented as long as, again, antibiotics were routinely used to eliminate these infections. So ultimately, again, this is a disease caused by chlamydia trachomatis, but specifically serovirus A through C. So here is a summary of basically all the organisms associated with infection of skin and eyes. A continuation of that summary. And yet again, another continuation. I do want to remind you, though, again, if I never mentioned it, then it's probably not worthy of you spending much time looking it over for the test, at least. So the idea is there are some things on here, like river blindness, that we never talked about. And that should illustrate to you, again, the likelihood of it being on the test is 0. Here's a visual summary of, again, what pathogens we find on the skin and eyes. So let's start talking about now causes of infection in the CNS, starting with meningitis. Meningitis is really going to be inflammation of the meninges and will be caused by several different things, including pathogens. I want to point out, though, that there are different levels of risk associated with this. By far, the most dangerous form of meningitis is acute meningitis caused by bacteria. We also see viruses being a common cause, but naturally, again, viral meningitis far less dangerous. So what are some signs and symptoms of meningitis? Well, we see things like photophobia, headache, painful or stiff neck, fever, increased white blood cell counts, and even, again, certain organisms will present with certain specific characteristics. So one of the things to understand is it can be acute or even chronic in the way it presents. Some organisms, again, more likely to be acute, others far more likely to be chronic. The overall idea here is in a healthy person it is difficult for a microorganism to gain access to the nervous system. And so overall, as long as you're healthy, the likelihood this infection occurs is not great. So what should we do if we suspect meningitis? Well, we need to quickly figure out the cause, so it's not uncommon to immediately do a lumbar puncture to obtain cerebrospinal fluid, at which point we can quickly gram stain or culture it and look for the cause. But we'll usually even start broad-spectrum antibiotics immediately because we do not want to offer any time for the microbe to grow, because even a short amount of growth could be enough to kill a person. So let's start going through some of the examples of what can cause meningitis, starting with probably the worst one that we have, which is Neisseria meningitidis. This is going to be a gram-negative diplococci that often again lines up side by side. As you can see here, this organism is going to be responsible for around 25% of all meningitis cases, which actually is a significant amount. And as I said before, this is definitely the most serious form of meningitis and can easily kill a person. The illustration here is suggesting, again, many of these infections come from a nasopharyngeal infection that makes its way to the CNS. One of the more troubling things that can happen is meningococemia, which is, again, very rare but very fatal. The idea is, again, the pathogen is going to now start affecting the whole body, and the endotoxins associated with it actually stimulate excessive amounts of white blood cell response, which could, again, damage the host. Streptococcus pneumoniae is the next thing I want to point out as far as being a cause for meningitis. Yes, it's more commonly known to cause pneumonia, hence why it's called pneumoniae, but again, untreated pneumonia infections could lead to then meningitis cases. Those people most likely to, again, have problems with this are those that are immunocompromised, because actually this is carried commonly in the population. Roughly about 1 out of every 3 people will have this inside of them. Streptococcus pneumoniae is going to be a small gram-positive flattened cocci that appears in end-to-end pairs. Again, strepto means chain, so these appear to be gram-positive chains of circles. We see this again in the CSF. We know that our concern would be strep. It does again have a capsule, which it prevents against phagocytosis, and it produces stuff like hemolysin and even again hydrogen peroxide, which can damage tissues in the CNS. Overall, strep pneumoniae very resistant to a lot of things like penicillins and cephalosporins and even macrolides. And so this one could be more difficult to treat, but good news is there's a vaccine available for this. Haemophilus influenzae is the next thing I would like to talk to you about. I want to point out how it's named influenzae, because for a very long time we thought this was actually a virus, but actually we now recognize it as being a very small gram-negative coccobacillus. This is often abbreviated as being HIB because it's the Haemophilus influenza serotype B that we're most concerned with. And this usually, again, would affect very young children, usually, newborns. And so the illustration is we often push the HIB vaccine very early, right after, again, birth, to try to prevent this infection from occurring. Listeria monocytogenes is the next pathogen that we should talk about. Listeria monocytogenes is actually going to be a gram-positive and is not going to be super consistent in its morphology, but can form things like coccobacilli. I want to stress to you that this does not produce capsules or endospores, but is actually very resistant to things in the environment like temperature, salts, and even pH. The illustration here is Listeria is commonly found out in nature. In fact, you see it all the time. But it's important for you to understand that your risk of Listeria is quite low as long as you have a healthy immune system. This is an interesting pathogen because it can move from one infected cell to another healthy cell, and in people where the infections are occurring, and naturally that could be again bad because the pathogen never has to really leave to the outside space where white blood cells could find it. If again patients are allowed to develop Listeria infections, we call this a listeriosis. Overall, again, as long as you have an immune system, it's not a big issue. But we do see cases of meningitis and even septicemia in those that are immunocompromised, really young, or even really old. And this pathogen can even pass the placenta and cause abortion of the fetus. I want to point out that this is found a lot in things like meat and dairy products. And it's actually super rare to go to one of these production facilities and not find this pathogen. Let's move on now to a fungal cause of infection, which is Cryptococcus neoformans. This is a fungi that can again cause meningitis. Overall, our protections against fungal infections are relatively high as long as the immune system is behaving right. So this becomes a big concern for those with broken immunity, including things like AIDS patients. These can be, again, life-threatening infections because they'll be fast onset. And ultimately, again, the body doesn't have time to react, and thus, potentially, the patient dies. This is going to be commonly found in nature, primarily in the form of bird droppings. So let's move on to another fungal infection in Coccidioides. This is going to be another fungal infection that can be picked up, but this one tends to be a little more virulent and as such potentially more dangerous. This thing grows quite well, again in and around body temperature, but again fungi need moisture. That's why it's interesting in where we find Coccidioides immitis. Again, being primarily found in very dry regions, there'd be lots of lacking of moisture. So that means this is going to be tied to a very unique situation, which is going to be the burrows of rodents. Again, in the burrows, the rodents are going to defecate and urinate. The defecation is going to allow for resources for the fungi to break down, and the urine is going to help provide the moisture that the fungi need. So this is most commonly associated with, again, rodents in the desert. The next thing we should talk about is viral meningitis. As I've already stated, viral meningitis tends to be very minor. There are several different causes of viral meningitis, but overall, again, very rare, and usually cleared up pretty easily. The vast majority of cases are actually caused by one virus in particular, which is enterovirus, and is primarily found, again, affecting children. But there are other things, including HSV2, or even things like other herpes viruses, like HHV6, HHV7, and HHV3. Arboviruses, arenaviruses, adenoviruses, and even HIV can cause meningitis if given an opportunity. As we were kind of hinting at, most of the time these viral infections of the meninges aren't very serious and are usually resolved very quickly. But notice how, again, extremely low the mortality rate here is, less than 1%. So the idea is there are really two dangerous forms of meningitis, bacterial and fungal. Viral, not really a real concern. So there will be several tables here to illustrate to you the comparison of the different causes of meningitis. Here you can see things like Listeria and Cryptococcus. And then we have examples of Coccidioides, which is fungal, and then viruses. So let's move on to neonatal and infant meningitis. I want to point out that this again will happen in the very young because they don't really have immune systems yet to protect them. And so inoculation usually happens during birth and can result in a pretty high mortality rate. I do want to point out though that overall the chances of death from this have been on the decline, which is good news, but the rates of infections have gone up. So let's talk about two common causes, which are Strep A. galactiae and E. coli. Both of these, again, can cause infections that potentially are fatal. We also have found Listeria monocytogenes, common in many cases of neonatal meningitis. So let's talk about Streptococcus agalactiae a little more. Strep A galactiae is going to be a Lancefield group B strep. This means that it's slightly less dangerous than something like Strep pyogenes. What's more interesting here is this is commonly found in the female genital tract, and as such would be introduced to the baby upon birth. So it's important to understand that we're going to typically want to swab the vagina before birth to see what threats are there, because if we actually use penicillin G or something like aminoglycosides with it, we could actually clear this up before baby is born, and thus the baby can have a natural birth without the risk of infection. E. coli, again, is another possibility. E. coli, though, commonly found in the colon, and potentially through birthing processes could be introduced to the offspring. But I want to point out that it's not all strains of E. coli. K1 is specifically the one we're most concerned with. Overall, again, whenever this infects the baby, there's a 20% mortality rate, so roughly 1 in 5 would die. But even those that do survive should have some degree of brain damage. So it's again necessary to swab the colon to look for this particular strain of E. coli so that we can clear it up before birth. So here's that summary of neonatal and infant meningitis. So let's move on and talk about meningoencephalitis. Encephalitis is going to be the inflammation of the brain. These are going to be things that can cause inflammation of both the meninges and the brain, and these are really going to be commonly things like amoebas. I did say commonly, and I want to stress to you that overall infection rates by these amoebas are quite low, but what is actually terrifying about these is the survival rates are also quite low. So let's start off with Naegleria fowleri. Naegleria fowleri is going to be a small flask-shaped amoeba that's going to move via, again, a pseudopod. Again, amoebas move via pseudopodia. The idea here, though, is this is something that can be commonly found in water. So swimming in warm or even natural bodies of water could, again, allow for introduction of this pathogen. Ultimately, these amoebas are forced into the nasal passageway, in which they use the nerves to make their way to the brain. Whenever it does again get into that subarachnoid space, we're going to see the development of a primary amoebic meningoencephalitis, or a PAM. This causes rapid and massive destruction to the brain and causes ultimately death. Again, of the cases out there, there's roughly been 133 in the US. There have only been 3 people that have survived. So overall treatment is not very effective. Acanthamoeba, again, is another protozoan. This protozoan can even invade broken skin, the eyes, lungs, or urogenital pathway. And this causes the formation of basically granulomatous amoebic meningoencephalitis, or GAM. This does, again, have a course of infection that is much longer and a slightly higher survival rate of around 2 to 3%. So here's our comparison of the amoebas that can cause meningoencephalitis. So let's move on to now acute encephalitis, or inflammation of the brain. One of the most common causes of this is actually viral infection. But since this is acute, it's also important that you understand it's a rapid onset. The idea here is this can come on so quickly that there can be obvious symptoms or signs like confusion or loss of consciousness and seizures. Herpes simplex virus can also cause encephalitis. Herpes simplex virus types 1 and 2 are commonly found in newborns, but again, that's typically through birth from an HSV positive mother. Older children and adults over 50 can also get this, but it's more commonly seen being caused by HSV1, which is oral herpes. The idea is, again, it can follow nerves that can cause inflammation of the brain. So here's the illustration of acute encephalitis. So let's move on to subacute encephalitis, meaning that symptoms take longer to show up and are less striking. The common causes here include toxoplasmosis, persistent measles, which we won't talk much about, but also prions. So let's talk about Toxoplasma gondii. This is going to be a very commonly seen pathogen around the world. We do see a significant amount of people being exposed at some point during their life, but really the concern comes whenever a baby is developing, so during fetal growth. The idea here is that toxoplasmosis can actually then cause damage to the fetus that could result in the loss of the fetus. Toxoplasma is actually going to be a flagellated parasite, commonly found in birds and many mammals. But the illustration here is most of the time it's held in felines because cats like to eat birds and small mammals. So the idea is this will routinely be found in feces. That's again why you can't be allowed to handle feces from cats while pregnant. Signs and symptoms are usually again asymptomatic. There may be some minor sore throat, lymph node enlargement, or even low-grade fever, but the concern here is the development of encephalitis. But as long as you have an immune system, you're okay. But since baby doesn't have one yet, they're at risk. So let's show you this illustration. So in order to show you the risk, let's use these cute little kittens to show you how they're going to kill this lady's baby. So again, this pathogen can be found in the rodent population. Cat eats rodent, defecates out the basically dormant version, and that can be picked up by the female to now pass the placenta to affect the baby. There's also this other pathway in which, again, meats can harbor the pseudocysts, which then can be consumed by the female and affect the offspring as well. So the idea here is you must always eat meat well cooked, and you must stay away from cat feces while, again, pregnant. I do want to show you, though, that the percent chance of transmission from mother to offspring is only sitting around 33%. But again, whenever you look at the potential outcomes here with stillbirth, liver and spleen enlargement, liver failure, hydrocephalus, convulsions, damage to retina, and blindness, those are risks that we don't want to take. So again, don't mess with cat feces if you're again pregnant, and make sure your meat is well cooked. So let's move on now to prion diseases. Prions we've talked about before as being again proteinaceous infectious particles. These are most commonly known to cause transmissible spongiform encephalopathies, or again the prions cause holes to form in the brain, making the brain appear spongy. There are several different causes, including again prions that cause CJD or Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease. There's Gerstmann-Strauss-Schinker, Kuru, fatal familial insomnia, we have scrapie in sheep and goats, and then we have again transmissible mink encephalopathy, and lastly the most commonly known one, bovine spongiform encephalopathy, which is again mad cow. We again don't know a heck of a lot about these due to the potential dangers of interacting with them, so it's best to again just stay away from any of them to limit your risk. As far as the details and how we think this happens, we understand to some degree that the normal brain proteins will be turned into a prion protein, PRPSC. The idea is that PRPSC will then allow for the formation or accumulation of more PRPSC, and ultimately those proteins accumulating will allow for plaques and spongiform damage to the brain or the development of the holes. But where do we see these things being picked up from? Well, often things like contaminated instruments that have come into contact with the blood or brain, but also potentially infected meats, including the brain. So here's an image illustrating again what is normal healthy tissue versus again spongiform tissues. Notice in the spongiform tissues we see these big old holes or gaps where again those plaques have developed. Overall again the idea here is subacute encephalitis can be very problematic, but by far the more dangerous thing here is the prion disease. So let's move on to rabies. Rabies is going to be again a zoonotic disease because it's being transmitted from animals to people. Overall it's a very slow progressing disease, and there are really ultimately two different forms, furious rabies and dumb rabies. With furious rabies, it's what you think of whenever you think of rabies. There's agitation, disorientation, seizures, even twitching. There's even hydrophobia. Dumb rabies, on the other hand, allows for the development of paralysis, disorientation, and stupor. Both, though, can end the same way, which is the development of a coma phase that then results in death. So where do we find rabies? Well, rabies is commonly found in mammals. So any wild mammal can be a source of rabies. I want to point out, though, that most of the cases are actually going to be spread in the U.S. between animals and humans, typically, again, being bites or scratches from pets. Roughly, we expect there to be around 35,000 to 50,000 human cases per year and around the world, but again, here it's quite rare. So this image is trying to illustrate the most likely cause of infection, and they're suggesting again things like skunks as being a source. You just need to understand that any mammals are a possible source, and you should avoid being bit or scratched by any wild animal. One of the important things to understand is that rabies can be prevented and treated, as long as again we catch it early. We must treat before again symptoms develop, because once symptoms develop, there's nothing we can do. One of the most important things that we must do, though, to limit our likelihood of seeing this is the vaccination of animals, veterinarians, animal handlers, lab personnel, and even again travelers. If we vaccinate, the risk of infection is basically zero. So here's the rabies disease table. So let's move on and talk about poliomyelitis, which is again a virus that's going to affect the spinal column and nerves. The idea here is it could potentially cause neuromuscular paralysis, which is a significant concern to us. This does again invade nerves and cause damage, and the idea is those nerves don't repair, so the damage could be permanent. So let's talk about how some of the ways we see poliomyelitis present, including paralytic disease. Again, we can have flaccid paralysis of muscles of the leg, abdomen, back, intercostals, diaphragm, pectoral girdle, even the bladder. We also see bulbar poliomyelitis, which again affects the brainstem, medulla, and cranial nerves, allowing for then loss of control of cardiorespiratory regulation and potentially death. The idea here is post-polio syndrome is something that can happen. So if people even again get past the infection, they can still have progressive deterioration of muscles well into their later years of life. So the idea here is we need to prevent polio from occurring. Humans are the only known reservoir, and so we can actually protect every human if everybody would get on board. The idea is the vaccine's been around since the 1950s and should be again routinely used, but there are still places to find polio around the world. As you can see here, most cases of polio have been widely eliminated. The few cases that we still see in nature do occur though in basically the Eastern Europe or even again the Western Asian areas. So polio again is a disease of great concern but can easily be treated through vaccination, so make sure you again get the vaccine. The next thing I want to talk to you about is tetanus. Tetanus is going to be caused by Clostridium tetani. Clostridium tetani is commonly found in the soil and even GI tracts of animals. The idea here is this is again a Clostridium species that does need an anaerobic environment. So if it's in the oxygen, it often forms an endospore. Overall, again, these things are going to exist in nature, but our concern is actually with its toxin. Again, the concern with tetanus is the toxin, which is a neurotoxin, which will disrupt again the way the nervous system interacts with muscles, causing then this inhibition of muscle contraction, causing muscles to contract uncontrollably, resulting in something called a spastic paralysis. The idea is that spastic paralysis results then in the inability for muscles of the respiratory pathway to work effectively and ultimately allows for then death. So here's an example of neonatal tetanus. Again, it's not uncommon to see that the muscles stay contracted or rigid, and the result then is a patient arches from their heels and the back of their head. There is a tetanus vaccine available and should be widely used. This vaccine is again a toxoid vaccine, which allows for protection against the toxin, which is our big concern. This is often part of a combo vaccine called a Tdap, which protects you against tetanus, diphtheria, and pertussis toxins. The idea here is again, vaccines should be given to children, and parents or adults should also get this vaccine to protect them as well. So here's the comparison of again tetanus. So let's talk about another Clostridium problem, which is Clostridium botulinum, which causes botulism. This is often an intoxication by ingestion of the toxin, which is an exotoxin. This usually happens again through eating poorly preserved foods, and we do see roughly 10 to 30 outbreaks per year in the U.S. The idea here, though, is that this toxin is going to disrupt the way the muscles would actually contract. So let's talk about how the botulinum toxin will work. The
toxin is going to travel through the bloodstream to the neuromuscular junction, at which point it prevents the release of acetylcholine, which then fails to allow for muscle contraction. The idea here is the muscles cannot contract because they cannot get the chemical message to do so, and as a result, flaccid paralysis occurs. I do want to point something out to you, that botulism toxin actually has a use medically, and it can be used to actually take and fight things like muscle spasms, migraines, and other conditions. But it's also used commonly cosmetically as something like the Botox treatment. Again, Botox stands for botulism toxin. So here's a botulism disease table. So let's talk about African sleeping sickness, which is going to be caused by Trypanosoma brucei, a protozoan routinely found in the blood. This is called a hemoflagellate, again living in the blood tissues. The idea here is this will be picked up and transmitted via the tsetse fly, and so bites from the tsetse fly can allow for introduction of this protozoa. This protozoa, though, is going to cause several signs and symptoms, including intermittent fever, enlarged spleen, swollen lymph nodes, and joint pain. But really what's more concerning is the development of brain disturbances, including personality and behavioral changes. We see extreme fatigue and sleep disturbances. We see really a situation where patients become sleepy in the day and sleepless at night. We see muscle tremors, shuffling gait, slurred speech, seizures, and paralysis, and eventually the destruction leads to coma and then death. Here's that summary of African sleeping sickness. Here's the overall summary from this chapter, which is again infections of the CNS. This is a continuation of that summary of infections of the CNS. Again, don't forget, if we didn't talk about it, don't spend a lot of time trying to look it up and study it. Focus on those things that we discussed. And here's lastly that visual reference for, again, infections of the CNS.